in a dim, windowless room inside Langley, Virginia. The silence was louder than the hum of the overhead fluorescents. 2 CIA officers stared at the man across the table, not with suspicion, but disbelief. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't sweating. He sat still, unshaken, with the composure of someone who knew exactly what he had done. He opened the brown leather folder and spread out 5 pages, hand-drawn radar sweep patterns, altitude and range charts, rotating schedules of Soviet interceptor wings, a full coverage diagram of the USSR's western air defense grid marked with blind zones. The United States had spent decades trying to model the Soviet Union's air defense system from the outside satellite imagery, high-altitude flyovers, intercepted communications, and in one night, this man had drawn more actionable data than years of technical intelligence ever delivered. The defector's name would never be released. His role, according to declassified fragments, was a radar operations specialist assigned to the PVO Strany, the air defense forces of the Soviet Union. For years, he lived in the shadows of phosphor screens, plotting American bombers, watching NATO exercises, and feeding Moscow reports of Western movements. But something had changed. Sometime in 1985, he walked into a Western embassy in a neutral European city alone, unarmed, and carrying a bag filled with documents that would shake the very core of Soviet strategic defense. He had made no demands. He had one offer to show the West what the Soviets couldn't see. Back in the Langley briefing room, the senior analyst leaned forward. "Are these real frequencies?" The defector nodded. "Yes, but only for the next 6 days. They rotate every week unless compromised." "And this," the analyst asked, pointing to a shaded crescent along the northwestern border. "Radar dead zone," the man said, "between 2 overlapping stations. If your aircraft come low under 200 meters, you can pass through undetected for about 12 minutes. 12 minutes! Enough to slip a bomber past the Iron Curtain. This wasn't just a breach. It was a strategic earthquake. In hours. The UA had gained not just Soviet radar layouts, but insight into how Soviet defense officers thought, how they responded, what they feared, and somewhere in Moscow, deep inside the Kremlin, the system that claimed it could see everything had just gone blind. For nearly 3 decades, the Soviet Union had convinced itself and much of the world that its air defense network was impenetrable. The PVO Strany wasn't just a military organization. It was a doctrine wrapped in steel, silicon, and ideology. With over 2,000 radar installations, layered interceptor squadrons, and a ground-to-air missile grid stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, the system had one core belief. No Western aircraft would ever enter Soviet airspace undetected. Not once. Not ever. This belief wasn't blind arrogance. It was built on blood and budgets. After the humiliation of the U-2 incident in 1960, Soviet planners had poured billions of rubles into radar coverage. They placed early warning stations along every frontier, launched over-the-horizon arrays, and even positioned mobile radar trucks to fill gaps in mountainous regions. Every aircraft, every bird, every anomaly in the sky was something to be tracked, logged, reported. Inside Kremlin briefing rooms, red-starred generals outlined interception, kill chains with the confidence of emperors. If NATO sent a bomber, the PVO would intercept it in 6 minutes. If a reconnaissance plane wandered too close, a MiG would shadow it before it crossed the border. To outsiders, the PVO looked like the one Soviet branch immune to rot. The U.S. intelligence community believed it too, at least partially. Decades of failed incursions, lost drones, and near misses had made even American planners cautious. Strategic bombers were kept far from Soviet borders. Surveillance aircraft flew with radar-absorbing modifications. The phrase "don't trigger the PVO" became standard inside every Air Force mission brief. But the Defector cracked that certainty open like a rusted hull. The Americans had always assumed the Soviet radar matrix was symmetrical, overlapping, and adaptive. But according to the Defector, that wasn't entirely true. Many of the stations were manually calibrated. Some relied on aging vacuum tube tech. Others had misaligned sweep arcs that created predictable dead zones. Several sectors were understaffed. In the Far East, entire coverage zones had gaps known to operators, covered by lies in paperwork. It got worse. The Soviets believed their redundancy meant resilience, but the Defector revealed a darker truth. The redundancies were the illusion. Only on paper did they cover each other. In practice, outages, miscommunication, and staggered rotations created moments of blindness, often just minutes, sometimes hours. The defense grid worked well enough to catch obvious threats, but it wasn't layered. It was patched. The revelation triggered a cultural shock inside U.S. intelligence. They hadn't underestimated Soviet strength, they had overestimated it. The room of wrong assumptions wasn't in Moscow, it was in Washington. Now, that room was being rearranged chart by chart, frequency by frequency by a man who had once sat behind a radar scope deep in Soviet territory, believing the myths himself until he saw too many lies stack into truth. And now, the Americans saw it too. The Soviet air defense doctrine wasn't just about tracking planes, it was about control of the skies, the borders, and the narrative. PVO Strany was designed as the Great Wall of the Sky, combining fixed radar stations, mobile SAM units, interceptor wings, and early warning aircraft into one tightly coordinated command structure. It was a marvel of centralized engineering, and on paper, it could do one thing with terrifying efficiency: crush anything that tried to fly into Soviet airspace. Every layer had its place. Low-frequency radar scanned for stealth. High-frequency arrays locked targets. Fighters stood ready on 90-second scramble drills. Data flowed vertically from station to district command to Moscow, then horizontally, across the vast continental air defense belts. It was hierarchical, disciplined, and relentless. But it was also brittle. The Defector's insights exposed the cracks no doctrine could cover. The system was slow to adapt, prone to human error, and suffocatingly dependent on central command. If a radar station went offline, replacement coverage was not automatic. It required manual coordination. If a tracking signature was ambiguous, commanders were more likely to ignore it than risk escalation. In peacetime, this made sense. In war, it meant seconds lost and opportunities missed. Even worse, the doctrine hadn't been updated to reflect new realities. Soviet planners still envisioned bomber raids in tight formation, like it was 1958. But American strategy had evolved. UES strike aircraft, especially those flying low with terrain-following radar, no longer announced their presence. They slipped under detection arcs, spoofed radar returns, and jammed with surgical precision. NATO's electronic warfare doctrine had outpaced the Soviets, and the Defector's files proved it. One of the most shocking revelations came not from what the Soviets had built, but from what they believed the Americans couldn't do. The Defector explained how many Soviet radar crews were taught that aircraft would never dare risk direct incursions. They expected conservative flight paths, cautious reconnaissance, and deference to the border. They were wrong. In the months following the defection, American planners realized the PVO doctrine had been frozen in time. It worked well against threats that played by the same Cold War rulebook. But stealth, deception, and unpredictability weren't accounted for. The system was designed to fight yesterday's war, and that war was already obsolete. Inside the Pentagon, new simulations were run, routes were plotted, jamming protocols were updated. Suddenly, entire corridors of Soviet airspace were deemed penetrable, not because of superior firepower, but because of superior understanding. Doctrine wasn't just about weapons, it was about assumptions. And the Soviet Union's most sacred assumption had just been shattered, that loyalty from within would never fail, that no one who knew the map would ever betray it. But one man had, and now the entire doctrine was one step from collapse. At first, it looked like a minor diplomatic curiosity. In March 1985, a Soviet radar operations officer, mid-tier, clean record. No known grievances vanished during a routine trip to a Warsaw Pact training facility in East Berlin. His name wasn't released. His absence was chalked up to unauthorized desertion. Moscow whispered theories of kidnapping. GRU officials assumed the CIA had somehow orchestrated a black bag abduction. But it wasn't that neat or that comforting. The truth, uncovered weeks later by a stunned Soviet counterintelligence unit, was far worse. The officer had walked into a Western embassy voluntarily. No threats, no duress. He entered alone. He asked to speak with an American, and then he began to talk, not just about schedules or locations, but about systems. He described specific radar sites down to their blind spots. He named watch officers, revealed alert readiness procedures, and most dangerously explained how the entire air defense matrix responded to different threat profiles. He even described how to trigger a false alarm inside the Soviet early warning network. In U.S. intelligence circles, it was called the first impossible event, because nothing in the CIA's Cold War playbook predicted it. Yes, the agency had recruited assets. Yes, they'd received low-level leaks. But a direct defection from inside PVO Strani, with full operational knowledge, voluntarily, that broke every model the agency had built about Soviet internal control. This wasn't a reluctant traitor. He wasn't trying to flee criminal charges. He wasn't coerced. He had simply decided one day, they are wrong. I can't help them anymore. He defected not out of fear, but conviction. The Americans were stunned by how calm he was during his initial debriefing. In the words of one CIA case officer, he didn't just give us documents. He gave us doctrine. Over the next 3 days, the man worked tirelessly. Redrawing radar arcs from memory, he listed 5 Soviet intercept protocols. He provided code names of projects the U.S. hadn't even discovered yet. In one session, he explained how mobile SAM units could be triangulated using only the timing of their command dispatch signals, a method that instantly made NATO targeting 60% more accurate. In another, he calmly described an entire Soviet response scenario in the event of a NATO surprise attack. From first radar contact to interceptor launch to command delegation, the man laid bare how the Soviet system would behave under pressure. And in doing so, he gave the U.S. something even more valuable than access. He gave them time to reroute bombers, time to reposition satellites, time to design countermeasures. This one act, a man walking through the wrong door, changed the shape of air war planning overnight. It shifted the balance of confidence. And inside the CIA, they had a new name for him. He was no longer a defector. He was a mirror. And Moscow's most secret fortress had just seen its own reflection. When the initial reports reached the Kremlin, they were met with outright rejection. The Politburo's inner circle dismissed the defection as disinformation, a CIA fabrication, perhaps a psychological operation aimed at sowing paranoia within the Soviet Defense Command. The man in question, after all, had been handpicked for his loyalty, a career technician, trusted with sensitive radar protocols, stationed on the western frontier. He had no history of dissent, no known contacts in the West. The idea that such a man would defect on his own, without leverage or coercion, was impossible. Or at least, it should have been. But as more intelligence filtered in vague chatter from East Berlin, quiet conversations intercepted between NATO air bases, an uptick in Western jamming tests along the frontier, it became harder to maintain the lie, and yet denial persisted. Not because the leadership truly believed the man was still loyal, but because accepting the truth would collapse too many internal certainties at once. In military briefings, PVO generals offered alternative theories. The officer had been kidnapped, or drugged, or perhaps replaced with a Western, double an actor trained to mimic Soviet jargon, in closed-door meetings. Intelligence officials insisted it was a setup. After all, they argued, how else could the Americans now be testing radar blind spots with surgical precision? But then the simulations started to fail. Intercept drills that had once taken minutes now dragged out beyond protocol windows. War games staged in the Far East began showing erratic signal loss and slower than expected response times. Data from surveillance flights over the Black Sea suggested NATO aircraft were probing radar arcs at exact altitudes the defector had mentioned. It was as if someone had given the West a playbook. In frustration, the KGB ordered a full internal audit of the PVO Strany. What they found stunned even the most hardened skeptics. Redundancies that looked solid on paper were non-functional in the field. Several radar stations had been falsifying readiness logs in some sectors. Low-altitude coverage was so poor that entire bomber squadrons could have flown undetected for 12 minutes or more. 12 minutes. In nuclear terms, that was an eternity. And still, Moscow refused to publicly acknowledge what had happened. The Kremlin feared more than embarrassment. They feared contagion. If one defection could upend the most vaunted defense system in the Soviet Union, what would stop others? What would stop a submarine officer from handing over missile launch protocols? What would stop a cosmonaut from revealing orbital reconnaissance programs? The real threat wasn't just what the defector knew. It was what his actions represented. Doubt. Inside every radar bunker, every missile silo, every encrypted command line. Moscow's supreme command was no longer sure who they could trust, and for a regime built on surveillance, discipline, and fear, that kind of uncertainty was more dangerous than any American bomber. So they buried the event. The officer's name was stricken from records, his unit reassigned, his family relocated. Internally, it was called a signal interruption. Nothing more. But outside the Kremlin walls, every radar operator knew the truth. Someone had told the Americans where to look. And now, they were watching more clearly than ever before. Within days of confirming the defection, Soviet intelligence shifted its attention to the next logical threat: American manipulation. If someone within the PVO had betrayed them, the KGB reasoned, it wasn't just a coincidence. It had to be part of something bigger, something deliberate. A theory began to take shape, quickly gaining traction inside Lubyanka's cold, concrete offices. The defector wasn't acting alone. He had been activated. The prevailing assumption was that the United States had planted deep seeds during the détente era, long-term agents embedded within the Soviet military complex who had been groomed for years to appear loyal, dutiful, and indistinguishable from true believers. The man who'd vanished in Berlin, they argued, was one of them, a sleeper asset turned loose at the right moment, under orders, to destabilize the radar doctrine from the inside. It was a convenient theory, and it was entirely wrong, but it fit the Soviet mindset. In a system built on control, betrayal could not be random, and there had to be a cause. And if that cause could be traced to Western espionage, well, then the defector's betrayal wasn't a failure of ideology or morale. It was sabotage. This belief became a shield against deeper introspection. By blaming the Americans, Soviet officials avoided confronting the uncomfortable reality that their own doctrine was cracking. They ignored the signs: declining morale, aging infrastructure, systemic corruption, and a growing ideological fatigue spreading through the ranks. To acknowledge these flaws would mean acknowledging that their air defense system, the pride of the Soviet military, was vulnerable from within. Instead, the KGB doubled down. They launched Operation Glasnost IV, a sweeping internal purge designed to root out any foreign-influenced sympathies among radar and SAM operators. Hundreds of personnel were interrogated. Dozens were reassigned to remote postings. A few quietly disappeared. Surveillance increased. Travel was restricted. Morale, already brittle, began to shatter. But no new traitors were found, because there were none. The defector had not been a planted seed. He had not been groomed by the CIA. In truth, he had grown disillusioned, not from foreign manipulation, but from loyalty itself. Loyalty to a Soviet ideal that he believed had been abandoned by the very commanders he served. He had watched budget cuts turn his radar station into a relic. He had reported system failures that were ignored. He had seen falsified readiness reports passed up the chain and accepted as truth. And when he realized that no one cared, when he understood that the system he had sworn to protect was lying to itself, he broke. He walked not to the Americans. He walked away from them. But Moscow couldn't see that. Wouldn't see that. They saw only treason and assigned it a foreign cause. The wrong theory, and because of it, they prepared for the wrong war. Even as the KGB intensified its purge campaign, a parallel theory emerged inside the Soviet General Staff. It wasn't just the Americans manipulating events. Some argued it was NATO's technology itself that had turned the tide. Specifically, they believed the defector had merely accelerated a process already underway, the gradual obsolescence of Soviet radar by Western electronic warfare. This theory, wrong, but dangerously plausible, posited that the true threat wasn't betrayal, it was invisibility. High-ranking Soviet officers became obsessed with one idea: that Western stealth aircraft had matured far beyond what Moscow had expected. The defector's testimony was no longer seen as the root cause of failures, but as confirmation that the Americans now possessed aircraft capable of defeating even the most advanced Soviet radar. This theory shifted the focus from treason to technology, and in doing so, it obscured the one thing the defector had tried to reveal: systemic failure. Military research councils were hastily retasked. Radar engineers were ordered to revisit every doctrine built since the 1970s. Low-frequency detection arrays, previously sidelined, were brought back into the discussion. New filters were added to tracking systems to reduce false positives from low-signature aircraft. The defense budget, already strained, was redirected to modernize signal processing algorithms. But no one stopped to ask, was any of this necessary? There had been no verified instance of a stealth aircraft penetrating Soviet airspace, no evidence that the Americans had fielded something beyond their known capabilities. And yet, the paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The mere possibility of a stealth threat redefined Soviet procurement strategy overnight. The irony. The defector had never mentioned stealth. He hadn't talked about the F-117 or radar-absorbing materials, or terrain-following sensors. He'd spoken only of procedure, of delays in command transmission, of inflexible doctrine, of radar arcs left unguarded due to overlapping bureaucracies. He had spoken about the human vulnerabilities of the system, but the Soviet command couldn't process that. To admit human error would require an admission that the centralized, top-down control model, the very heart of the Soviet military, was flawed. So they blamed stealth. They blamed jamming. They blamed ghosts in the sky. And in doing so, they built weapons to fight phantoms. They hardened radar sites that didn't need hardening. They spent millions on signal amplification, when the problem was organizational redundancy. They poured resources into detecting targets that weren't there, while ignoring the real reason the West was outmaneuvering them. Better strategy, faster adaptation, and most of all, information. The second wrong theory, like the first, was easier to believe than the truth. Because the truth would have required a confession no Soviet general was willing to make that the enemy hadn't bypassed their radar. He'd walked through the front door and told the world where it all was. The Soviet Union prided itself on one illusion above all control: the KGB's sprawling surveillance network, the GRU's deep cover assets, the PVO's watchful eyes over the skies, all built on the belief that nothing happened without being seen, recorded, and responded to. But by the summer of 1985, it became painfully clear that the system designed to protect the state had failed at its core function, seeing the truth before it was too late. The defector, now housed in a NATO safe house, guarded 24 hours a day, had already triggered a seismic shift in Western strategic planning. But what truly stunned U.S. intelligence wasn't what he revealed about radar placements or detection windows. It was what he revealed about Soviet blindness. Time and again, the man described scenarios in which vital intelligence had been misrouted or ignored. Radar operators routinely filed false positive reports just to avoid punishment for incomplete vigilance. Alert drills were simulated with outdated protocols. Air defense sectors routinely overlapped or conflicted in zones where no single commander had final authority. The reality of the Soviet radar web was fragile by design, not because of its hardware, but because of the bureaucracy that controlled it. And still, back in Moscow, no one had a full picture. Within the KGB, counterintelligence operatives believed the radar breach was contained. Within the General Staff, planners assumed they had neutralized all relevant gaps. And within the Kremlin, aging leadership clung to the belief that nothing crucial had been compromised. That compartmentalization, the foundation of Soviet intelligence doctrine, was now its greatest vulnerability. Each branch withheld data from the others to protect its own position. There was no unified report, no admission that NATO had gained a real-time advantage in any future air war scenario. In fact, Soviet leadership continued to issue public statements boasting of total electronic superiority well into 1986. Inside Langley, CIA officers couldn't believe their luck. Not only had the U.S. gained insight into one of the most guarded systems on Earth, but the Soviets refused to admit it had happened. The most damning revelation, a complete intercept protocol for NATO bomber intrusion, that the defector had described a sequence involving 9 command relays, 3 confirmation layers, and a rigid launch order chain was found by Western analysts to have a built-in 2.7-minute delay from first detection to actionable launch. In a modern war, that wasn't a delay. That was a death sentence. Western bombers could cross the critical airspace threshold in 90 seconds. That meant they could strike targets before Soviet missiles could even be authorized to fire back. The intelligence failure wasn't just in missing the defection, it was in misunderstanding its consequences, by failing to respond, by doubling down on wrong theories and comforting lies. The Soviet Union had effectively opened its skies without realizing it, not because they lacked radar, but because they lacked clarity. The Americans hadn't needed to hack the Soviet air defense network. They'd simply watched it rot for years. Soviet planners had crafted their understanding of American military doctrine around a core assumption: the U.S. war machine was too decentralized, too corporate, too soft to operate at scale under crisis. They believed that when the time came, bureaucratic inertia and fractured command chains would slow American response times and dilute effectiveness. They couldn't have been more wrong. As NATO's understanding of Soviet radar vulnerabilities deepened, thanks in part to the defectors' revelations, the United States did not simply sit on the intelligence. It adapted, with precision, with speed, and with a level of integration the Soviets had never anticipated. The true strength of the American system wasn't stealth, or satellites, or secret aircraft. It was doctrine, a warfighting philosophy that emphasized jointness, flexibility, and initiative. While the Soviets clung to rigid hierarchies and inflexible launch protocols, the U.S. trained its radar operators, pilots, and intelligence officers to act in concert, often without waiting for top-down approval. In real terms, this meant that by the mid-1980s, an F-111 deep strike package could be redirected mid-flight based on real-time data from an AWACS platform. It meant that jamming profiles could be tailored mid-mission to match newly exposed Soviet radar frequencies. It meant that if a Soviet radar station went dark or came online unexpectedly, American forces didn't panic. They recalibrated. The difference was systemic. At Ramstein Air Base in West Germany, U.S. electronic warfare officers, EWOs, ran simulations based on the defectors' data. What they found was chilling, at least from the Soviet point of view. Given the known latency in radar reaction time and the gaps in overlapping coverage, a squadron of low-level strike aircraft, flying nap-of-the-earth profiles, could penetrate deep into Soviet airspace without ever being seen. More alarming, if the Soviets did detect them, their own command approval structure would delay any response until it was too late. This wasn't theoretical. During red flag exercises and NATO simulations, strike teams practicing against simulated Soviet defenses routinely achieved penetration rates above 80%. The most lethal combination, an ECM-heavy package involving EF-111 Ravens to jam, F-4G Wild Weasels to suppress SAM sites, and F-111 Aardvarks or B-52s for deep strike. Each pilot, each weapons officer, each jammer technician operated with precise awareness of the larger mission. That was the true American system, not just better weapons, but a better way of fighting. In 1986, the Pentagon quietly initiated a classified series of exercises based entirely on the defectors' radar map, known internally as Iron Stare. These weren't just drills. They were dress rehearsals. The target Soviet command and control sites buried deep in Belarus, Ukraine, and along the Arctic frontier. The results were devastating. Soviet planners had assumed their radar zones overlapped like an impenetrable net. But Iron Stare proved otherwise. There were cracks, blind zones, relays that took too long to react, frequencies that could be spoofed, antennas that could be blinded with pinpoint bursts of broadband noise, and every one of those vulnerabilities had been hidden in plain sight until one defector exposed them. Meanwhile, the U.S. wasn't merely focused on radar. It was building redundancy into its entire command chain. If an AWACS platform was destroyed, a satellite would fill the gap. If a strike plan failed, the next tier down was ready to improvise, and if all else failed, human initiative drilled into every officer would ensure that the mission went forward. This wasn't chaos. It was controlled unpredictability, and in the face of a Soviet machine built on obedience, that unpredictability was fatal. The defector had offered coordinates, but it was the American system, nimble, decentralized, data-driven, that turned those coordinates into targets. By the time Soviet leaders realized how much ground they'd lost, the Americans were already flying training sorties through their blind spots, and the worst part, they hadn't even needed to change their flight paths. It wasn't fought with missiles. It wasn't fought with tanks or bombers. It was fought in the space between two doctrines, in the gap between what the Soviets believed their radar system could do and what it actually couldn't. The humiliation came not in war, but in the cold. Methodical revelations of war games and black operations. By late 1987, a series of NATO exercises had exposed the full breadth of Soviet vulnerability under the code name Night Ice. American strike pilots ran live drills simulating attacks on Soviet early warning arrays using the exact topography and timing the defector had provided. From the outside, these flights appeared routine. But inside NATO command centers, real-time footage showed bombers passing through kill zones without detection. The final insult. They weren't even using stealth aircraft. Just disciplined flying, synchronized jamming, and superior coordination. The Soviets knew something was wrong, but they had no idea how much. PVO interceptors scrambled without targets. SAM batteries received conflicting orders. Radar screens showed nothing or worse, everything, as American jamming created so many false returns that operators couldn't distinguish threats from noise. And still, the official doctrine remained unchanged. A small number of Soviet air defense officers tried to raise the alarm. One colonel, overseeing a remote installation near Smolensk, filed a classified report claiming his station had been digitally blinded for over 3 minutes during a NATO exercise. The report disappeared. He was reassigned. But word spread. Whispers circulated through PVO regiments that something was wrong with the screens, that detection times had slowed, that targets moved faster than commands could react. Then came the incident. During a joint Warsaw Pact exercise, a simulated American bomber penetrated the defensive ring around a high-priority asset, a nuclear storage site in southern Belarus. The site's radar crew never saw it. The aircraft, piloted by a NATO-trained East German officer flying on the Red Team, reached its target, dropped a mock payload, and escaped without triggering a single alarm. The footage was leaked within hours. Soviet brass pulled every radar commander in the sector into an emergency debrief. No one was punished, not officially, but half the officers were transferred within weeks. Some never returned to radar duty. For the first time, Soviet commanders faced the undeniable. Their enemy hadn't just mapped their defenses. He had dissected them. And in that realization, decades of pride shattered. The vaunted PVO, the shield of socialism, as Pravda once called it, had been rendered obsolete by an enemy who hadn't fired a shot. Not because the Americans had more powerful weapons, but because they understood the system better than the people who built it. The humiliation was silent, but total. And unlike the battles of old, this one left no ruins, only shadows on a screen that once promised protection and now delivered none. The Soviet radar system was supposed to be the wall, the final barrier that kept the West out. That gave the Politburo confidence. That reassured missile commanders deep in Siberian bunkers that when the time came, they would see the enemy. But after the defectors' revelations and the string of humiliating exercises, the wall had become a window and worse, a mirror reflecting failure not just in hardware, but in ideology for decades. The Soviet military had championed centralized control as its defining strength. Every division, every radar site, every fighter squadron operated under rigid chains of command, ensuring complete loyalty and minimal error. But in war, rigidity is not discipline, it's delay. The Americans had exploited this, turning flexibility into a weapon, used doctrine, empowered field commanders to adapt, to pivot, to improvise. The Soviet Union punished such behavior. In NATO, an officer who spotted a radar blind spot would be promoted. In the USSR, he'd be demoted for admitting weakness. This cultural refusal to acknowledge flaws had created the illusion of strength. Now the illusion was collapsing. Soviet generals began to quietly reassess the foundation of their strategic thinking. The radar system's failure forced a painful question. What else had they misunderstood? If their vaunted air defense network, into which they had poured billions, could be compromised without a shot fired. What did that say about their command bunkers, their missile silos, their submarines? Confidence was the first casualty. Strategic doctrine meetings turned into arguments. Old guard officers clashed with younger reformers. Some demanded massive re-engineering of the radar network. Others, more quietly, suggested surrendering the pretense of parity altogether, acknowledging that American technology had outpaced them in ways they couldn't recover from. This internal fracture didn't stay inside the Kremlin. In Warsaw Pact states, radar operators and air defense commanders began requesting American manuals and translated NATO material, anything to understand how the West had outmaneuvered them. In East Germany and Poland, surveillance crews no longer trusted the data they saw on screen. Some even refused to sign off on readiness reports, fearing future accountability. Meanwhile, U.S. policymakers watched the shift with cold precision. They didn't escalate. They didn't need to. The Soviet system was eating itself from within. The Americans knew the real war wasn't about bombs or planes anymore. It was about belief. Belief in a system, in doctrine, in leadership. And across the Soviet Union, that belief was cracking. By the end of 1988, the Soviet Air Defense Network had quietly rewritten dozens of protocols, but it was too late. The trust was gone. Officers no longer believed their screens. Technicians second-guessed every alarm, and command centers operated in a constant state of simulated vigilance, unsure whether they were watching the sky or just pretending to. The final irony: the Americans never used the defector's information in combat. They never had to. He'd already detonated something far more powerful than a bomb. He'd exposed the lie the entire Soviet security architecture was built on. That control equals safety, and once that belief was gone, everything else followed. Today, the radar towers still stand. Along the lonely stretches of the Russian steppe, rusting parabolic dishes point skyward, long since deactivated. In former Warsaw Pact states, abandoned control bunkers lie buried beneath overgrown forests, their terminals blank, their lights dark, their operators retired, scattered, or long gone. But the ghost of what happened never left. The defector who triggered it all remains nameless in declassified records, his identity sealed, his fate unclear. But his impact lingers in every Cold War analysis, in every post-mortem of the Soviet collapse. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a scientist. He was a radar officer, one man, who dared to tell the truth about a system built on silence. And that truth shook the foundations of an empire. To this day, military academies across the world study what happened after that defection, not because of the data itself, but because of how it revealed the rot beneath the metal, how a single weakness ignored, denied, and dismissed could unravel the confidence of an entire command structure. The Soviet radar network was never truly defeated by force. It was defeated by knowledge, by the idea that in war, as in life, it's not enough to be strong. You must be right. You must be honest about your limitations. And in the Cold War, honesty was the rarest currency of all. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, analysts cited economic stagnation, political reform, ethnic unrest. But in the shadows of that collapse stood the stories like this one, where strategy crumbled. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper that said they see us, and we never saw them. The ghost of the Cold War does not wear a uniform or carry a weapon. It flickers across screens, it hides in false confidence, and sometimes it takes the form of one man